Greetings, sisters and brothers. I am here to share some reflections on the future faces of spirit. I am someone who has been immersed in the fields of religion, philosophy, and education, and I've spent a lot of time with integral theory and Buddhist meditation, and I teach meditation to people in a way that integrates practices from Buddhist traditions with integral and metamodern frameworks of meaning and interpretation. And my initial response to this future-facing theme is to visualize how spread out we are as a species, how diverse and multifaceted our emergence will continue to be. So much is happening all at once, and there are so many different levels of analysis we can explore. So I want to say a bit about some of the underlying general themes of what may be happening, and then I want to try to focus in on some of the places where I think a closer unpacking may be helpful. So I'll begin by naming some of the presuppositions and contextual features that I'm operating with, and with some disclaimers about what I am not saying and not doing. Some of the things I want to say could be easily misunderstood. So I want to name at the outset, I am not presenting a fundamentalist view about why things are as they are, nor am I claiming with utopian certainty what will happen in our collective future, nor am I suggesting that we allow ourselves to collapse into privileged or new age perspectives that encourage us to deconstruct other people's views while privileging our own. I will be talking about historical directionality and development in human potential, individually and collectively, and I will be trying to invoke the potentials and promise that these frames allow, because part of what spiritual discourse and religious language has the potential to do is to inspire and provoke frames of meaning that transcend the boundaries of conventional discourse, to protect and nurture communities of inquiry and practice as they explore the field of possibility and try to bring new ways of being into form. So that is my intention in my use of language, however imperfectly I enact it. And I am not saying that the evolution of consciousness is going to solve all of our problems. If it sounds like that at times, it is because there is a partial truth that can be disclosed by evolutionary and developmental frameworks. And utopian aspirations and ideals are a meaningful feature of our search for meaning. What is required as we traverse our own development is the ability to hold the tensions of developmental frames and to not reduce, oversimplify, or overdetermine their shape or meaning. This is a theme that I want to circle around, the ways that we need to recursively and iteratively integrate and reintegrate polarities and partial truths with both and thinking and holistic feeling. We can't say everything at once, but the ability to hold the tensions and apparent conflicts and partial truths and narrative subplots, enabling the fullness of the always prior wholeness of reality to live in and through dynamic and partial narratives, is part of what the future of religion may ask of us. The overarching context of this inquiry assumes that when we ask questions about the future, we are effectively trying to clarify and tune into the directionality of emergence. We're trying to discern the grooves and paths along which novelty and creativity manifest. We are unfolding. Life is unfolding. Thinking about the future of religion directs us toward envisioned worlds where people are ever more understanding the evolutionary and developmental contexts of their understanding, where we can be ever more self-aware of the process of how our perspectives are developing. We can anticipate that cultures of religiosity may become ever more consciously and self-referentially development and process-oriented. And these cultures are already being shaped as communities of practice around the world, while still existing in a broader cultural milieu that remains almost completely blind to and in denial of the significance of human development. Simply acknowledging the prevalence of that denial can help us to see that we're still very much in the beginning stages of our coming into being as a species that has the capacity to develop consciously and intentionally. It's old news as an idea for some of us, but at the same time, it's still very nascent and marginalized at the macro scale of humanity as a whole. In addition to that evolutionary context, we have to acknowledge from the beginning how everything is connected. The ways in which religion and spirituality will unfold through us will always be co-determined and co-emergent with the ways we enact politics, education, technology, and economics. All of these areas of life can be seen as sharing directional patterns. There are potentials and possibilities that we can anticipate, which may seem to be pulling us forward, however much we kick and scream and resist the transitions. Integral theory sees this meta-directionality as a process of evolution, unfolding in accordance with tenets and principles and morphogenetic patterns of development. Some metamodern philosophy thinks of this directionality similarly as emergence towards social and cultural attractors, as in an all-encompassing complex system. Or we can think of these attractors as gravitational hyperobjects, spiraling our apparently chaotic and unpredictable behavior ever closer to particular ranges of experience and behavior. However we articulate it, we don't have to be fortune tellers to simply acknowledge that what lies on the horizon has the potential to unfold in a dialectical relationship to the systems and structures of the present. Even with minimal presuppositions about the tenets and principles that will influence what happens, we can postulate that the future of human religiosity and spirituality will not arise in the modern world system. It will co-arise as an expression of a future world system. We could spend a lot of time thinking about the potentials of continued globalization and whether our increasing interconnectedness and tangible interdependence as a planetary species will lead to some form of new world order or to a more decentralized and localized network of globally connected sovereign groups. But either way, the nation states and structures of governance that we currently thrive in and suffer under will not last, nor will the clearly unsustainable modern systems of economics, financialization, production, and energy use. Much about our planetary social and technological infrastructure will change. It is already changing and collapsing, and in the post-coronavirus world, the pace quickens. So as a broad stretch, that's the view that I'm assuming for this audience. We are indeed evolving as emergent properties of an unfolding process, and the patterns, grooves, and qualities of this process can be ascertained and attuned with to some degree, so that the perpetual flowering of complexity and consciousness can increasingly become an experiential and meaningful aspect of our direct experience as people, as individuals, as collectives, and as a species. The ways that we are able to think about and understand ourselves in the context of evolution as embodiments of that universal process can become ever more non-conceptual and immediately perceived and holistically experienced as what is happening. This is another theme that I want to circle around, to look at the meaningful and qualitative differences between conceptual understanding and embodied understanding, and to help us move from theory to practice by pointing out some of the ways that we are getting stuck as individuals and as subcultures and as a species, and what it will take for us to liberate some of our collective energy in service of the whole process. Because ultimately, I'm not trying to offer ideas to help people feel good or rest easy. I'm trying to disclose a narrative that provokes a clarity of responsibility and behavior that is ethical and helpful. So that's context. We are tuning into the directionality of dialectical development as it is taking place perpetually and simultaneously in every sphere of life. And from that process-oriented perspective, we can think about what that implies about the possibilities and potentials for religiosity and being in the world. This means that we can anticipate and help facilitate practices, narratives, frameworks, structures, and networks of relationship that embody and express what Wilber calls our emergent unconscious, the shared potentials and possibilities that we see glimmers of in individuals and groups, which all of us are invited to experience, develop, shape, and make conscious and concrete in our social world. Each of us can envision a much more beautiful world, and individually we hold ideals and are drawn to exemplars of conscious, loving, benevolent ways of being. Everyone listening to this talk who seeks out information and discourse related to these topics already has a vision of what their heart desires and knows that they long for more truth, beauty, and goodness in the world. And we long to embody and to be that goodness and to enact the process that facilitates it. So our work as individuals who are living through this time of transition and who will have to learn to be the embodiment of what we desire and to create the norms and practices that will transmit those ideals into relationships, our individual paths are all crucial to this process. And what we are doing right now is leaning into what's next for ourselves as individuals in a way that attunes us to what is needed for the collective. We're sensing into what the whole wants and needs, and we're feeling into the next step to take on our path. So I want to try to focus in on two areas of the spectrum that are unfolding, with an eye toward what we can do to help facilitate positive emergence and to liberate potential that is blocked or repressed or stuck in these areas. Because when we think about the movement of humanity over time, we're obviously not talking about a homogeneous monolithic glacier. We're talking about a swarm of individuated beings, increasing in number and diversity and stretching out across the dimensions of space and time, as well as across the probability space and possibility space of consciousness. The probability cloud of conscious beings continues to expand and diversify. So from this angle, we can't just refer to humanity. If we're going to say anything specific or injunctive, we're going to have to specify what area of the spectrum we're referring to. So I'll try to focus my prescriptions and reflections on two areas in particular, or two fulcrums or transition points, where I think significant growth can happen, and where there is potential for people to make meaningful shifts in perspective. We can think of them as two areas of concern where we seem to be forming cultural patterns of pathology and regression and conflict. And if we can identify and heal these patterns, it could do a lot to serve the growth of the whole. Some of these patterns are very visible in popular culture and what we call the culture wars between traditional, modern, and postmodern perspectives. We can think of these as first-tier problems where people identify and propagate particular ranges or frequencies of thought and experience that range of identity and sense-making as the truth or as representing the way things are objectively, without a deep appreciation for how their views are shaped and dependent and relative, and how expansive the spectrum of possible legitimate views is. Relationships that source perspectives from the first tier are inescapably rivalrous and rife with conflict. Whether pre-modern, modern, or postmodern, whether liberal or conservative, the patterns of conflict persist. So helping people to move through this realm of conflict marks a crucial threshold. The range of the second tier that we want to grow into is where awareness of awareness increases enough to enable more effective metacognition and a deeper sense that one's view is a perspective amongst a range of legitimate perspectives. And we can begin to move into more both and thinking and less reductive either or binary frames of reference. We see that all truths are partial and yet some are clearly better and or more complex or more mature or more appropriate than others in context-specific ways. We also can begin to conceptualize and understand reality in its unity and diversity, in its multiplicity. We can resolve some of the logical paradoxes of our conceptual world by seeing the inherent polarities of ideas and concepts. And we can begin to see how every view, at least in general structural terms, is natural and justified and relatively valid according to a sense of developmental and contextual appropriateness. And we can do this without succumbing to relativism and without failing to make meaningful judgments about the relative merits of certain views and actions in specific contexts. But this seeing is cognitive, it's conceptual. It's a perspectival expansion, a broadening and deepening of the vista of sense-making, comprehension, and understanding. If you can understand integral theory and metamodern political philosophy and actually source metasystematic frequencies of sense-making, that's awesome. It's meaningful. And it can be positively psychoactive to stretch our thinking in these and other ways. But for those of us who are leaning into the edges of culture and discourse, the next steps for us are to embody our complexity in ever more heartfelt and sensitive ways so that we continue to deepen our perspective and experience and continue to serve others in ways that meet them where they are. This is our directionality and our shared potential. And it's a capacity that is lacking in some of the communities that espouse evolutionary and developmental worldviews. So this is the second threshold I want to investigate, where we have the potential to shift from both and thinking to both and feeling, or holistic feeling awareness. So focus on the upper middle of the spectrum at the threshold of moving beyond the first tier problems of perspectival conflict, where we can see a lot of unproductive energy being spent in our society. And then also looking at another major threshold beyond the capacity for perspective taking and metacognition towards the intimation of a shift that we can feel into at the further edges of our experience as we move from complex cognition and perspectival integration into embodied compassion and helpful service. These are the thresholds we need to cross if we are to create the future we long for. At one time or another, everyone can find themselves somewhere within the range of these patterns and potentials, or stuck in pathological forms of stagnation and repetition. So the better we understand the contours of these terrains, the better we can navigate them in the spirit of ongoing growth and learning. I've heard it said, as you probably have too, that the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed. We can say the same about human development. And we can see that collectively, we're all over the place. So we have to keep in mind the breadth and range of perspectives that we're holding and nurturing. The great stretching out of human consciousness will only continue to stretch and widen as more of us pass through these thresholds. So when we're thinking about the future, we need to think about the process of stretching an increasingly broad spectrum of perspectives into the future simultaneously. We have to attend to both the healthiest expressions of our individual and small group experience and the multiple centers of gravity of the collectives that we're connected to. Even if we're not going to see the emergence of widespread awakening and supermind consciousness in our neighbors and politicians anytime soon, we can encourage less either or thinking, more both and thinking, and more established norms around taking multiple perspectives and meta-perspectives. And we may find that establishing these next steps for the collective to normalize and legitimize both and thinking and metacognition works elegantly in tandem with this other realm of work that needs to be done, which is leaning into the boundaries of feeling awareness into ever wider embraces of the whole field of experience in humanity. So we're looking at how we're helping in the process of expanding the mind and expanding the heart. And the more we expand our care and compassion, the more we can be of service to others to help them expand their cognition. We're moving from insight to service to helping distribute insight, or from metacognition to compassion in the service of more metacognition. This is how I'm visualizing a way of holding these different aspects of what's developing simultaneously and symbiotically. So we have this double vision that we're cultivating, with attention to what it means to explore the edges of experience, to hold and process as much as we can, as consciously and lovingly as we can, and at the same time giving care and attention to the full spectrum of humanity, and in particular, the places where we see people getting stuck and needing the most help. When we turn our attention to the broader collective and the center of gravity of society and subcultures, it doesn't need to be an overly academic or intellectual exercise. As much as we can, we want to be grounded in simply looking for context, helping ourselves and others to look for different facets and aspects of situations, and creating gaps between thoughts and views and reactions. It's about fostering practices of reflection, psychotechnologies of reflection and discourse, in addition to psychotechnologies of meditation and spiritual practice. So for now, in this time between worlds, our work is to build a bridge to the future by identifying and embodying the meaningful and helpful features of the views that are disclosed at the further reaches of our development. And we're doing this with one eye on cultivating the leading edge and one eye on raising the center of gravity of global humanity. But also understanding this not just in terms of cognitive complexity, but also in terms of our effective value means, the symbolic worlds that people have available to them, the historically emergent worldviews that operate through us as countless assumptions and propositions about the world, and which shape the overall patterns of understanding that we shape with language, the structures of meaning and cultural patterns that we spread through communication. So offering support and building the bridge means fostering collective intelligence, sense-making, and capacity by normalizing both and thinking and metacognition, but also fostering deeper value patterns and cultural ecologies of meaning-making and narrative. We need to build bridges from rationality to meta-rationality. We need to help people move on from and grow out of the postmodern breakdown of rationality and negativity towards systems into value memes and narratives that enable integration, unity and diversity, and new forms of personal and social meaning-making and purpose. We can help to spread the view that, yes, systems do always get used by the powerful inequitably, but the rationality that creates systems is a necessary stage of our humanity and our thinking, and it is absolutely up to us to continue the process of using our conceptual power, organizational power, and the power of pro-social values to iteratively shape and reshape the systems we are embedded in. We have to own the power to shape society instead of criticizing and othering those who wield power. And surfacing this notion of power and the shaping of social systems brings us back to how everything is connected and the importance of what social structures and systems are in place to hold and shape our experience and growth. We want to enable a postmodern culture of productive and collaborative discourse rooted in post-nationalist, post-ethnocentric, post-tribalist identity, supported by post-capitalist and post-socialist economic systems, and hopefully moving into a post-scarcity and post-rivalrous social world that has mitigated the existential risks of exponential technology and artificial intelligence. With all of that on the horizon, assuming we can hold open the doors of possibility and continue to increase the clarity of that positive vision for the future, we should look to target the areas of discourse and behavior that need the most help. I'm envisioning a kind of cultural acupressure to try to create a healthy movement of collective energy and sense-making and help it flow in the direction that we envision for the sake of the whole. For instance, it's crucial to consider how important the most fundamental aspects of our development are. As we move through the stages or fulcrums of growth, we move through processes of relating to the fundamental life forces of food, sex, power, and belonging, which Wilber associates with the first four chakras. We can look at our culture's collective health in terms of fixation, addiction, or allergies to food, sex, and power, and see that they're deeply dysfunctional at the core of our developmental health. Some of us spend a lot of energy criticizing modernity or criticizing postmodern relativism, when very few people are even accessing healthy versions of those perspectives because they haven't experienced healthy development through the foundational structures of their being. In order to foster healthy development across society, we need to ensure that everyone's basic needs are met more adequately. This is a key insight in the metamodern work toward creating a listening society, a society that is oriented towards serving everyone's psychological and emotional needs. And an essential premise of this view is the basic necessity of a well-established modern system of social welfare. Moving in that direction in policy and social infrastructure in the United States and globally is essential if we're going to enable more widespread self-actualization. Right now, in the midst of a global pandemic, it's amazing to see how simple ideas that have appeared obvious to many for so long, the need for universal health care, the need for debt relief for the most vulnerable who have borne the burden of inevitable debt accumulation due to the built-in structural mechanisms of inequality, monopoly, and capital consolidation, and the need for some form of universal basic income or something similar. It's amazing to see how these ideas are now all of a sudden so much more explicit and on the table in response to our current economic crisis. Even if most people are still seeing these measures as temporary or limited, these basic ideas do embody, however imperfectly, concrete examples of the abstract needs that we have to attend to. Our basic physical, medical, relational needs of safety and security, which are absolutely essential to establish for everyone if we're going to enable more people to move through stages of growth with healthy agency and communion. Another aspect of this bigger picture is that all of these ideas represent the basic value of equality and seek to concretize and make real and tangible a sense of equality among all people. This basic equality, in contrast to the ways that we allow ourselves to justify inequality and injustice, is so incredibly deep and important, and I think we often take it for granted. We're just beginning to really come to terms with the implications of actual existential, metaphysical, spiritual equality. Modern ideas about equality represent just the initial and immature flickerings of our actual unity in ground value. And we can see that the power of those ideas in their current and previous forms is not adequate. They're so weak that we can espouse that all men are created equal for centuries and not include women. It's another great example of the difference between thinking something conceptually and embodying a truth wholeheartedly with feeling awareness. And even conceptually, it's meaningful to consider the depth of our species-wide historical endowment, the unfathomable debt that we all owe equally to the shared accumulative evolutionary history of our ancestors and everything that came before us. Literally every single thing that has ever happened has enabled us to have access to everything that we take for granted. All technology, all engineering, all the learning and struggle and work that led to our relatively utopian world of electricity and transportation and communication and food production and organization. No one born, no one alive today has any greater right to that all-encompassing endowment than any other. We need to really reflect on that, to move that insight from the synapses deep into the bones and organs and tissues and heart of humanity. That is our directionality. That is our path, and the inner work from which improved policies will be established. And reciprocally, supporting policies that embody and establish tangible expressions of equality can help to facilitate the inner work of getting past thin and weak ideas about equal rights and into deeper and more holistic embodiments of real solidarity. It is also a profound corrective to developmental narratives. We must ensure that we balance our ideas about development with equally deep insights about equality. That structural and policy level dimension of our shared experience is so crucial when we think about ensuring the health of the whole. And the fact that almost everyone is struggling with the basic problems of healthy growth at the most fundamental structures of their being. With that in mind, I want to turn my attention more pointedly into the messy terrain of our increasingly fragmented culture, to consider some potential guidance for our brothers and sisters who are engaged in various forms of cultural warfare and conflict. This is a big topic that really deserves its own talk or book, but I want to take some time to talk specifically about the current state of the culture war related to identity politics, with a focus on race and the need to wake up from being woke, because I think it may represent a key leverage point for unleashing cultural progress. The clash of perspectives around identity and social justice in the US may be impeding us from moving forward with liberated and unified energy toward common goals and aims as a collective. My hope is that if we can improve our narratives and frameworks about this pattern, we can release some of that potential and help people find a deeper solidarity with each other. It is also a way of getting more specific and concrete about one particular facet of postmodern culture, which is often spoken about in general terms, and to highlight what it can look like to move beyond postmodern critique and into a metamodern critique in service of growth and solidarity. So when we look at patterns of identity, it is important to distinguish between the structural aspects of stages of growth that humans go through and the contingent, culturally specific, and learned aspects of how we see people behaving and communicating. It would be a huge mistake to think that something like racism is universal or necessary just because it is a feature of our society, even cross-culturally. There may be a general trajectory from egocentrism to group identity through increasingly wider circles of inclusion and empathy, but beliefs and ideas about groups of people are learned, and it is absolutely possible to learn nonviolent ethnocentrism. I've worked with kids for a long time, and it's actually not that hard. But the point here is just to distinguish surface structures from deep structures. Cultural meaning about how to think about people is distinct from the general psychological structures of recognizing difference, forming stereotypes, and making generalizations that interpenetrate group beliefs. Increasing the scope of inclusion and broadening our sense of identity are developmental processes, but particular forms of group-based exclusion and derision are learned and cultural. Looking at the convergence of deep structures and surface structures and how the development of identity is playing out with a focus on the United States, we can see there are clearly many people who are continuing to perpetuate unfortunate, unhealthy, unnecessarily noxious forms of racism in the US. And there is, of course, a long history of racism here, tied to slavery, white identity formation before and after the Civil War, narratives that have been propagated to justify civic and economic inequality, and the many feedback loops that have reverberated through time as waves of suffering. Creating a society where less people fall prey to overt immature racism is certainly important and relies on structural changes in economics, media, and education. But what's more interesting developmentally is the abiding tensions between people who ostensibly agree that racism is bad. We can learn something about how to get to the future we want by looking at what we call traditional modern, postmodern, and metamodern approaches to anti-racism. But we can also see this is a great example of how cognition and increased perspective taking is not enough. We need to engage the heart of humanity more broadly and consistently in our discourse to make the progress we need. So from a traditional perspective, where abstract variables can be grasped individually, but are not easily seen in relationship to each other. We teach children and people in general that racism means being unfair to someone because of their race, and that is bad, and we simply should not do that. We should not be racist. Simple. Greed is bad, freedom is good, love is good, hate is bad, racism is bad. Simple one-dimensional abstractions. It's fine if our kids start here and learn from early on that discrimination and prejudice are not good or fair, and certainly not encouraged. We can think of modern anti-racism as growing into a more formalized rationality where multiple variables can be accounted for. We can see that if X, then Y, but we can't effectively shape many variables into a coherent system of thought or ethics. From this perspective, we can posit that racist views are shaped by cultural and social influences. We may think that racism results from social and economic inequalities and may work to reinforce and perpetuate those inequalities. And we can hold a conception of human rights that may or may not project our own cultural context onto others, but at least does hold a generally consistent ideal of equality and seeks to not just shame races, but to ameliorate the underlying economic and civic injustices that perpetuate racist attitudes. This was the center of gravity of the civil rights movement, fighting for social and economic equality in league with racial equality. It is an initial iteration of world-centric consciousness and universal human rights, where all people are seen as equal under the law. A more postmodern anti-racism begins to problematize the simple linear ideas of what causes racism and begins to see that the situation is a little more complicated and intractable. The impulse here is to try to see an overarching system of relationships that have more explanatory power. Thus, we find the idea of systemic racism emerging as a logic of sense-making to explain why racism persists so perniciously. More dots are connected, but the image that emerges from the connections is then seen to explain just about everything. Racism can be seen as a widespread property that emerges in societies in relation to inequality and imbalances of power, and we can have a longer-term view of what would be involved in ameliorating racial and ethnic tensions. But even a fully developed systematic logic has deep shortcomings, because no one system of variables can explain the complexity of social reality. We would need to be able to hold multiple systems and their relationships in dynamic tension with each other without reducing any of them to one of the others to begin to have an adequate grasp of the variables and dynamics involved in human behavior, and how to foster novel and creatively holistic approaches to even approach anti-racist ideals. The systematic postmodern anti-racist can't quite do that. They reduce reality to the system of oppression and seek to explain just about everything through that framework. But a much bigger problem is what Freinach calls downward assimilation, where the systematic perspective has created an ecology of thought and sense-making, which explains things like racism and injustice in terms of systems of oppression and power. And that kind of thinking has helped to shape a cultural code or symbolic world of discourse. And the language and ideas that gain prominence and influence culturally, precisely because they do add something to the conversation that was not surfaced or grasped from the modern perspective of one-dimensional rationality. This systematic discourse spreads throughout the culture and is picked up and recycled and used and abused by people of all ages who don't actually see or understand the operations of systems themselves. It is assimilated downward into less complex structures of sense-making. It is easy to talk about systems of oppression and power and use sophisticated sounding language to basically express a more traditional view, like racism and racists are bad, and to make simple associations and generalizations about large groups of people, like white people, in the name of anti-racism. But this is really unhelpful and has created a big cultural backlash from many whites who also don't see reality from the systematic perspective, so can't even acknowledge the partial truths of these anti-racist perspectives. And of course, it's not a primarily cognitive experience. It's a deeply emotional and embodied engagement on both sides. To critique others and make moral accusations connected to identity, and to feel accused and blamed for things you can't control or change. These are situations that facilitate developmental regressions into more immature and self-defensive positions, when what is needed is a softening of the tone of discourse so that we can support more mature and sophisticated systematic and meta-systematic approaches to complex social problems. There are many layers of irony and tragedy that we can see emerging from this cross-fertilization of perspectives of varying complexity and the often misappropriated codes and language games of different subcultures. In terms of really being able to see for oneself how the general properties of systems relate to each other, to see how sociology, psychology, historical contingency, economics, and public policy all hold pieces of a larger puzzle that can, in fact, be put together sensibly and coherently. You need at minimum to enact a metasystematic perspective that can ascertain when to apply a principle of a system of thought and how it relates to general principles that other fields have identified. For instance, we can see that there are deep psychological predilections for prejudice. Making generalizations and forming stereotypes are exactly what minds do without exception. This is basic psychology and neuroscience. Those quasi-universal brain-based tendencies toward the categorization of things and people interact with a wide range of historical genealogies. So innate prejudice is cultivated in very different ways based on how we are educated and parented. And those cultural forces of influence are strongly influenced by broader social narratives and socialization, which are largely influenced by economics and inequalities of money and power. So for example, when the basic drive to gain power and influence and money is combined with the tendency to stereotype and generalize, and is reinforced by social narratives that seek to justify and perpetuate the inequalities that derive from those drives and imbalances, as happened over the course of centuries in the United States, very deep-rooted influences and intergenerational effects and traumas are unleashed. These are the feedback loops that reverberate through history as waves of suffering and violence. And what I see happening as of 2020 is a lot of good people taking different perspectives on an ever-changing, evolving interplay of systems and cultures and discourses and values, but failing to honor the basic goodness of where those with different pieces of the puzzle are coming from. And I really think that some social healing needs to happen so we can come together across races and perspectives. We're going to need to find a way to change how we engage discourses around the topic of identity politics and race in particular. So there are two things that I think really need to happen that we should focus on that will help us to bring people together across the aisle of the culture war and begin to make more progress on more pertinent issues like transforming our economic and political systems in solidarity with one another. On one hand, those who are holding the postmodern narratives of anti-racism and are working hard to fight injustice and inequality really need help to see the underlying inconsistencies and problems that they're contributing to and acknowledge the validity of the anti-progressive backlash. You can see this anti-progressive backlash in the reascension of nationalism and the overt racism represented by Trump, and in the more intellectual emergence of an anti-postmodern modernism. which is seen in some aspects of the intellectual dark web and some pseudo-integral and pseudo-metamodern subcultures that love to critique postmodernism. There are very real and unfortunate ways that postmodern anti-racism has gone too far and has become counterproductive. And it's really hard to say that in progressive subcultures because the social pressure to be seen as anti-racist is so strong. But it needs to be said more consistently by more people who really get and empathize with the anti-racist struggle. Those of us who see the historical legacy of slavery and can acknowledge the cumulative, incalculable impacts of centuries of violence and structural inequality and injustice, from Reconstruction to Jim Crow to the war on drugs to the new Jim Crow, and the persistent realities of white privilege in various contexts. All of that is real and needs to be felt and held as a crucial partial truth of our shared history. But the tragedy lies in the perpetual reduction of social life to that narrative, and the reduction of complex social forces and relationships to those racialized aspects of our story. Perhaps most importantly, what happens when we persistently racialize our experience and stories is that we continually reify, solidify, and concretize very partial and limited and limiting aspects of who we are. We continually reinforce the problem at its root and deepen the social divides by relying on narratives that highlight race and ethnic differences. As Foucault himself actually said, the dangers of identity politics are that it casts as authentic to the self or group an identity that is in fact defined by its opposition to an other. Reclaiming such an identity as one's own merely reinforces its dependence on this other and further internalizes and reinforces an oppressive hierarchy. Postmodern anti-racism is trying to dismantle the master's house with the master's tools, and it won't work. And what's happening is we're reinforcing the social construction of race that we're fighting against, while also creating unproductive reactions from white people, precisely because of the ways that we're all the same. Of course they will get defensive, and so would you. And whether or not you see that is maybe the deepest test of whether or not you really believe in human equality. Can you see that we're all fundamentally fragile, defensive, imperfect, and inconsistent social constructions on a path of individual and collective development? If so, then stop the blame game and join the solidarity movement, which requires solidarity with perspectives that are different from yours, even people with very light skin who don't play anti-racist language games. The truth is that because we are all equally human, we all feel the burden of socialization and history. No individual or group living today is more to blame than any other for anything that happened in the past. It's the flip side of the insight that we all equally deserve to share in the spoils of collective human toil. It is equally our birthright to share in the benefits of technology, invention, development, progress, innovation, and the totality of human wealth, precisely because of our fundamental ground equality. And for that same reason, it is absurd to associate the horrors of the past with anyone alive today. And it is perfectly valid and a perfectly valid human response for a white person who experiences suffering of all kinds, and quite often economic and social misfortune as well, because we all know there's a whole lot of poor and disempowered white people. It is quintessentially human of them to get defensive and feel attacked by narratives that group white people together stereotypically as though they are all privileged and complicit in racism. It is a colossal both and insight that needs persistent naming and acknowledgement. The truths of systemic and historical racism are real. Intergenerational and continuous injustice along racial lines is real. If we want others to believe and act like we're all equal, we need to actually act like it every step of the way. And also acknowledge that every person alive today is equally innocent and guilty. And we need to call a truce on all blame and shame regarding our past, or it will keep weighing us down and reinforcing the divisions, and we'll stay locked into thinking of ourselves as racialized bodies in fundamental opposition to those whose bodies are different. We have to see it both ways, but we can't have it both ways. We cannot dismantle racism by reinforcing racial identity. So the problems of postmodern anti-racism are real. And my concern is that it is unconsciously holding back the development of many people who are otherwise poised to grow beyond the codes and identity of the postmodern meta-me. We can see extreme examples of this dysfunctionality when we look at higher education. Perhaps the saddest example was what happened at Evergreen University, when angry students and some staff wrongfully shamed and forced the resignation of Brett Weinstein, a professor of evolutionary biology. There's a 3-part documentary on YouTube that you should watch if you want to see the dangerous downsides of downward assimilation and the failures of pre-rational postmodern culture. It would be hard for me to describe or exaggerate how unreasonable and irrational that situation became, and the complete failure of an educational institution to actually be educational and help incredibly privileged young people to think rationally and reflect on their behavior. And this is the culture that those with an allergy to postmodernism love to caricature and demonize. And their partial truth needs to be reckoned with so we can move on and establish more widespread maturity on these complex issues. The identity of being woke, which ends up ironically reinforcing one's racial identity, is just not conscious enough. That's why I say we need to wake up from being woke. But on the other side of the coin, we have this perhaps equally unfortunate anti-green, anti-social justice warrior, anti-postmodern contingent, very prevalent on social media, that intellectually, to some extent, sees the performative contradictions and exacerbations of immature postmodernism. But many who see these problems to some degree also enact their own identity contraction, often as white people with thin skin who bristle at the notion that they should grapple with the historical and ongoing validity of real racism and their very real white privilege in certain contexts. And of course, they often share the characteristic that they don't really understand the metasystematic perspectives of the individuals who formed the grooves of thought that led to postmodern insights. As a tangent, briefly, when we invoke the names of people like Marx, Wittgenstein, Heidegger, Derrida, Foucault, we're referring to an echelon of perspectival complexity that is different than what most of us are coming from in conventional discourse. And there just aren't that many people who can or will actually imbibe and grok those perspectives in their nuance and originality. So there's a massive downward assimilation happening in these invocations and references on both sides of the political and cultural divide. And that's even true in university philosophy departments, not to mention on Twitter. So it's funny, but it's sad because both sides in this culture war are misrepresenting both the ideas they refer to and rely on and each other. And they both mirror the all too human foibles of the other, precisely because they are all too human equally in ways that perfectly demonstrate the underlying sameness and imperfection and solidarity of the human family. Postmodern anti-racists become obsessive social justice hammers, finding racist nails everywhere, and yet blatantly manifest the same stereotyping, reductive classifying, prejudice, and racialization that we find in different forms cross-culturally and cross-historically. I'll give one more example, which is the book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. It's a well-intentioned book, but it's also a great example of performative contradiction, and it accidentally helps to undermine some of the problematic premises of the postmodern stance. The author, Kendi, makes an interesting move by moving away from the idea that racism refers to a system of oppression and can only go one way. He says, no, racism is simply any idea or behavior that treats groups of people as better or worse than others. And to his credit, throughout the book, he gives examples of many times that he, as a Black man, thought or acted in a racist way. This is refreshing and different from a lot of anti-racist discourse, because part of why so many white people get defensive and contract and react against postmodern anti-racism is because it is framed as an all-encompassing system that white people are both responsible for and benefit from. So there's no way out. You're inherently guilty, and any attempt to deny it is perpetuating racism. And you can't even point to how your imperfections are fundamentally human, because it's a one-way street. There's no such thing as reverse racism because there's only one way it played out historically, and it just so happens that white people captured the power and therefore racism benefit whites. And that is all mostly true. But Kendi, who's respected on the anti-racist left, says, no, it's simpler and more intuitive than that. Anyone can think or act in racist ways, and in fact, we all do. I don't sense that many anti-racist progressives have really grappled with the implications of that argument, but it would be really good if they did. But unfortunately, the conclusion that he draws from this is that every single thing that happens, every law, every thought, every action is either racist or anti-racist. And being good means perpetually trying to be anti-racist. He effectively reduces the complexity of systematic postmodernism to a simple binary, another clear example of downward assimilation. He points to the universality of prejudice, which manifests in racialized contexts as racism. But then he reinforces the frame of race even deeper so that everything is seen through the lens of race, and life becomes a perpetual battle against the inner potential to be racist. He literally says that every law is either racist or anti-racist, as though that were an objective fact and not a lens that we can choose to enact. It may be a valid lens, but it is a lens. It's a very reductive vision of reality. We're so deeply enmeshed in postmodern cultural codes and racialized identity and a culture of victimhood. If we try to be good progressive people, we're convinced we have to go along with this kind of thinking. But we're only deepening the grooves of our limited identities and conceptions of self. We are, in fact, racialized and gendered beings in bodies, but those are extremely limited and partial aspects of what we are. We contain multitudes. We are so much more than that. And it is so sad to see these reductions of selfhood reinforced and defended by strong cultural norms and social virtue signaling. I have worked in education for 15 years, and I have seen these postmodern pathologies up close and personally for a long time, enacted by the most lovely and ethical and well-intentioned people. But what they don't see, by and large, is that the more we reinforce race and gender in our discourse and thought and cultural codes, the harder it is for us to grow beyond our limited identification with thought and personality and individuality. That is why it matters profoundly in the context of religion and spirituality, and why I wanted to make and draw out this connection. The ways in which we reify and reinforce our limited and limiting identities works against the natural and purposeful unfolding of our individual and collective growth and development. And it is important to see that there is still positive value and intention in this anti-racist impulse. It's very important. And that is what the anti-postmodern critics lose sight of. Evergreen and Antifa are extreme examples, representing the cultural opposites of tiki torch marchers and the Tea Party. But the vast majority of folks who are reverberating and propagating the frequency of postmodern anti-racism are really thoughtful, caring, moral people who deeply long for a more just and equitable world. The performative contradictions they enact need to be held with care and concern and compassion, not derision and mocking. So this is why we need to continue to develop metamodern and integral frames of sense-making in explicit and politically conscious ways, in service of the broader unfolding of complexity and consciousness. There's a huge gap between reactionary, anti-leftist, anti-green, postmodern ologies and the thoughtful, productive, mature guidance of beings who are holding more, seeing more, and including more in their worldview and their embrace. Aggressive postmodern racial blame and white shame is not conducive to increasing solidarity towards shared aims, but neither is hating on wokeness and using a frame of rational superiority to justify a disengagement from the struggle for social justice. I mean, just think about the fact that the words social justice have become a derogatory association. These are strange times. White men profoundly display their emotional fragility by calling well-intentioned young people social justice warriors and snowflakes. It's hilariously tragic. And to what end? We fail to self-actualize as individuals, and we fail to coalesce as a collective to work for the greater good. Spiritually and politically, we are falling short. So this is my plea. If you resonate with critiques of postmodernity and frustration with the green meme, stop parroting integral talking points and really check in with yourself about how you are including and embracing anti-racism and the healthy desire for social justice, not just cognitively, but wholeheartedly. Don't be a modernist wolf in integral sheepskins. Integrating healthy aspirations for equity and social justice is essential in any positive vision of metamodernity or game B or the religion or spirituality of tomorrow. Integrating systematic schema for social justice and equity means loving the green meme like a parent loves a child. If you can't do that consistently in an embodied and mature way, you're not holding open metamodern or integral or game B space, and you are part of the problem. We need to wake up, grow up, and clean our room, and then help the postmodern kids to clean theirs. And if you resonate with anti-racism, social justice, and generally green values, that's awesome, but you need to ask yourself some hard questions. How do we adjudicate the ways in which individuals and groups are equal, and the ways in which some ways of living are better than others? Do we want to encourage our children to see themselves primarily and fundamentally in terms of their skin color or ethnicity or gender? Are there universal values like equity, justice, love, and trust that transcend culture, that can be used to make helpful judgments across cultures? When we invoke visionary leaders like King and Mandela and Gandhi, we are invoking universal visions of transracial, transcultural, and transhistorical solidarity and brotherhood and sisterhood. We're not invoking a call for affinity groups or seeking amends for microaggressions or reinforcing habits of victimhood. Wake up. We've lost sight of the scope of the healthy modern vision of equal rights and universal humanity. And we desperately need to reintegrate healthy versions of that into our postmodern narratives of multi-perspectival solidarity. Just as the words green and social justice have become symbols of disdain for modernist reactionaries, the words colorblind have come to represent cultural incompetence in progressive circles. And again, an important partial truth. To deny the reality of the social construction of race is to deny the very real and toxic ways that the construction of racial difference has been and is used to perpetuate and justify injustice and violence across racial boundaries. To acknowledge the impacts of race is an important step, and to deny it altogether is very problematic. But another important question for my anti-racist brothers and sisters: what is the end goal? Even if we weave an equitable social tapestry of multi-ethnic diversity and equal rights, what is the omega point of our social experiment? Stagnation is not possible. Change is the only constant, and postmodern narratives are stale. We cannot hold on to the present any more than we can deny the past. And the way to move forward together is in alignment with the directionality of the evolutionary process. I'm not saying the ways in which we integrate unity and diversity are predetermined. I am saying precisely that they are not, and we must figure it out together by acknowledging the ways that we are all in this together. But when it comes to the construction of race and our genealogical deconstruction of the ways and reasons it was shaped as it was in relation to inequality, we can still see that it is okay to reappropriate and instill shared aspirations for a post-racial future. And identity politics is necessary, useful, and important in certain contexts at certain times. The identity politics of feminism facilitated social progress toward equal rights for women, and the women's suffrage movement was built upon the abolitionist movement. If we don't name and acknowledge when particular groups are marginalized, we can't make progress toward equity. There are states in the US that didn't ratify the 19th Amendment until the 1970s. Patriarchy and racism are not fake news. The struggle continues for women and people of color in different ways than it does for white people, and this should not be controversial. But it is also true that the struggle exists in one way or another for everyone, both and. And when we understand the struggles of humanity in a context of the universal principles of growth and emergence, it helps us to gain the necessary perspective to not get sucked into solipsistic victimhood. We have to hold the privilege of progress and the ways in which our current lives are already utopian in some ways, along with perspective on how some aspects of our life world are in deep crisis and despair. Both and. It's a matter of priorities and perspective. The fight for civil rights and women's rights and gay rights are appropriate and important, and now it is time to shift. It is time to shift our social narratives to transcend and include the diversity of personalities and bodies and subcultures, and to begin to establish the post-racial, post-national, post-rivalry, post-materialist narratives that can usher in the religion, spirituality, civics, economics, and politics of the 21st and 22nd centuries. And we can elicit a similar analysis for any social issue. This was just an unpacking of one piece of the cultural puzzle. We can look at gender and sexual identity, climate change and global warming, or how we are responding to the coronavirus in similar ways. It is helpful to see how the patterns of interpretation and sense-making relate to each other, and what the underlying needs of the whole are. But in each case, seeing the relative perspectival complexity of different views is helpful, but not necessarily injunctive. Seeing complexity does not always tell us what to do, and we need clarity not only in our analyses, but even more so in our injunctions. I think that unpacking issues like identity politics can be helpful, but where it leaves us is in a place that is open to a new appreciation for simplicity, a simplicity that can affirm the need to perpetually decenter our narratives and just listen to other points of view with openness and respect, to hear where others are coming from. Try to find the places where perspectives overlap and diverge with genuine curiosity and openness to novelty. And most importantly, to attend to all relationships with care. These are the simple practices that elicit growth at every stage. Whether we see the other as a parent sees a child, or as a student sees a teacher, or as a disciple sees a Buddha, we must try to learn to see with the eyes of love and respect and empathy. We don't get to cosmic consciousness and third-tier awakening or the democracy of enlightenment if we can't begin by decentering our narratives, recognizing the fundamental equality of all humans, and establishing social structures that reflect that existential equality through systems that secure equality of access to food, shelter, healthcare, and the meeting of basic needs that is the endowment of our cumulative development as a species. So that's my attempt to make some connections between our evolutionary context, the potentials of our future being in the world together, the relationship between social welfare and the foundational structures of psychological health, and the terrain of first-tier problems that manifest as culture wars and identity-based patterns of developmental stagnation. If we see the meaningfulness of the evolutionary frame, and if we want to help cultivate postmodern game B cultures of inquiry and solidarity and conviviality, these are some of the things we need to attend to. We need to embrace social justice and political progress in ways that ensure that we meet the basic needs of all people through means like debt relief, free healthcare, and basic income. Culturally, we need to help more people grow out of their identity-based narratives and into broader conceptions of cosmopolitan solidarity. And each of us individually has a responsibility to continue deepening our meditation practice and our awareness of our own self-contractions and patterns of reactivity. There are definitely other ways to put these pieces together, but one way or another, it's all connected. So the big idea is we have to attend to these different areas of the spectrum at different levels of proximity, individually, culturally, and socially. This is not the way. The way is not determined. But these features of our world are real, and the spectrum of humanity is real, and the ways in which we hold care for as much as possible is what matters. And that is what will shape the future. However helpful our maps and theories may be, they are rooted in the past. We have to chart our own path for our own journey toward the horizon, into the uncharted territory we are facing as a planet. Having a narrative of why life makes sense and what to aspire toward enables us to feel a sense of purpose, and that is so important. But there is a difference between understanding our purpose and when purpose is revealed through alignment with a sense of wholeness, through a direct connection to wholeness. We need to practice tuning in to the open field of guidance and intelligence. The promise and potential of our religious and spiritual future lies not just in increasing complexity and both in thinking and perpetually going meta, but in knowing and feeling and experiencing the fullness and wholeness of our lives, moment to moment, and perpetually leaning into the revelation of what to do and how to be and how to express it right now. This is where theory meets practice in the present moment of our felt experience. There is a flip that can happen, a release into the intelligence and sensitivity that permeates everything, a release into the incredible intelligence that maintains the homeostasis of trillions of cells in the body and the coordination of galaxies simultaneously. It's a release into a holism that is indubitable, that is a priori to any understanding of it. It's an implosive holism, an ecstatic holism, and is unbounded and ubiquitous. It saturates time and memory. It's present as an ecology of saturation through deep time, awake to the unknowable depths of inclusion, where literally everything is included. The memory of everything that has ever emerged continues to be held, so we hold it, and we become the unfolding, the holder, the holding, and the held, the parent, the child, and the birthing. We learn to witness as a loving witness and realize awareness as a loving feeling awareness. Learning to access and embody the simple practice of loving awareness is the individual linchpin that can enable cultures of care and new forms of religiosity and sacredness. Culture is fundamentally how we care for and communicate with each other. For me, the future of religion means cultivating cultures of care in a sacred world as expressions of a sacred world. We will continue to shape new iterations of perennialism, drawing from the history of religious exemplars and practices and lineages, but the essence of the process relies on more individuals appreciating the simple sacredness of their experience and allowing that appreciation to shape their relationships. I don't know what new religious forms will look like, but as a loving witness, I'm very happy to see cultural emergence like political metamodernism and game B discourse. And I actually see these two manifestations as representing different archetypes of cultural evolution. Metamodernism represents gradual change and creativity through continuity. It's a logical conclusion to the problems of the present, a dialectical resolution of the deep problems of the modern world system. It's a symbol and expression of our collective karmic trajectory. Game B is more orthogonal. It represents radical novelty and the predictable miracles of fundamental step changes in the evolutionary process. It's a symbol and expression of our collective creativity and the beauty of possibility. Socially and politically, it seems to me that we may have to go through more developed stages of metamodernism or green social liberalism to establish a stronger foundation from which something like Game B can emerge. But that very well may not be the case. Small-scale iterations of Game B may start a new trajectory with new attractors. And it seems that cultural evolution can and will take both forms simultaneously. In the realm of religion, we can already see both. We see the traditions are being pulled into new discourses and changing slowly, and other subcultures and sanghas are also finding new forms of purpose and identity through integrations of perennial and updated practices and shared experiences. I expect we will continue to see both forms of emergence in every sphere of life. The dialectical continuity that emerges as responsive resolutions to current problems, and the experimental offshoots that bubble up to form new pathways of possibility. As this continues, the various domains of the life world will continue to overlap and influence each other. In modernity, we saw the separation of the value spheres and the life worlds of science, religion, and the state. The world on the horizon may be one in which these spheres are reintegrated so that the sacredness of the religious impulse is more able to permeate our worlds of education and governance and science. And for religiosity and a sense of the sacred to spread through the life world, we will need to have really good answers to help people understand how to wake up and grow up and why we need to incorporate spiritual practices in our life. Our stories need to be connected to practices and revelations of experience. An intellectual understanding of the spiritual path can help to align the will with the grooves of growth that already exist as real potentials. So we shouldn't discount or diminish the role of theory and the search for intelligible explanations of mind and reality. But if you read and engage in ideas but don't connect to the importance and necessity of meditation in some form, you're missing something very important, because the relationship between content and context is decoupled in your experience. We typically get sucked into mental content and lose sight of the context of awareness and embodied being that arises in relation to that mental content as the essential subtext of that content. And this is what meditation can be: the ongoing awareness of the interdependence of content and context. All content of experience arises dependently with the context of awareness. And when we keep the content of our mind coupled with an awareness of the broader space of possibility within which experience arises, we can refrain from contracting around and identifying with particular thoughts, beliefs, ideas, or constructions of self, and hold open the aperture of consciousness so that the process of unfolding can continue to arise naturally in the field of experience. Meditation can be the natural revelation of this inherent intelligence. It is the allowance of intelligence to manifest in an integrated way. It is revelation because it is a revealing of what's always already there. Intelligence is always already present and is always facilitating growth and change. It is the perpetual, ongoing allowance of healing, allowing one to be grounded in an embodied intelligence which is experientially very simple, direct, immediate, obvious, open-minded, and open-hearted. I teach and explain meditation in this way because I think it can help to see it as a natural process, as the integrated emergence of broader and deeper perspectives and experiences coming through the self-structure. Meditation is a facilitation of the emergence of ever broader and deeper perspectives, the facilitation of ways of experiencing life in ways that are ever more expansive, inclusive, meaningful, and valuable in one's direct experience. When we elicit meditation in this way, it opens up a possibility to engage one's life as a mindful process of becoming, and to actually experience oneself as an emergent property of a universal process. And by watching ever more closely and paying attention to one's mind and sensations, and to all of the integrated aspects of our experience of thought and the senses, the more we tune into that, the more we are able to tune into the quality of being as a universal process, and that we can also see happening through other beings in other ways and other forms. Increasing our sensitivity to the field of experience enables us to tune into the pregnancy and potential of the unfolding present. The more that we source our emerging geo-historical meta-narrative from that open sensitivity, the more we will be able to articulate a coherent cosmopolitan identity that is consistent with science and inclusive of religious and spiritual experience. If we're learning and teaching in this subculture of sense-making, we're already partaking in translineage and post-conventional religious formations that are taking shape within the context of a perpetual pull of planetization and the dialectic of global transformation. Everyone is invited to tune in and join in the process of making sense from that field of shared coherence and inquiry and openness. This is the second shift that we have to make together. It is not a conceptual complexity or learning to take multiple perspectives cognitively or practicing both and thinking. That is important and perhaps necessary, but not sufficient. Ideally, it is a support for learning how to embody both and feeling. We can feel the wholeness and unity of experience, of the life process, and that feeling can manifest as authentic and natural loving kindness and empathy for everyone and everything. When we look at the perspectives and discourses that constitute and permeate our culture and media, we can see that we're not there yet. Even many of us who have sought out and have been exposed to integral and metamodern and meta-rational discourse and teachings consistently fall short of embodying those perspectives in a way that enables other people across the spectrum of worldviews to consistently feel seen and understood and loved. That is our directionality. In Wilber's integral framework, he posits 3 tiers to describe this progression, from thinking and experiencing separation, otherness, and firm psychological boundaries, to being able to cognize and see how opposites are related and differences can be integrated meta-systematically, to actually experiencing unity and wholeness. So if we're going to engage in this kind of sense-making, and if we're going to try to understand the unfolding of what is happening in terms of growth, then we should give careful consideration to these distinctions between the identity-based patterns of first-tier problems, practicing both and thinking and taking multiple perspectives into account to seek integration and complementarity, and holding wholeness and unity in our hearts while radiating love and understanding for our heterogeneous humanity. The process has the potential to unfold in the direction of increased sensitivity and intimacy. It's all about developing an increased sensitivity to our own existence. And the appropriate display of that development is to be found in our increasing sensitivity to each other. The present moment is always the open doorway that opens itself when we enter with more presence. We can always step just so into the embodied physical world and step into a new world. And it seems to me that there is a positive relationship between us doing just that and the beauty of the future we inhabit. The more carefully, tenderly, thoughtfully, and lovingly we present ourselves to the opening of the next moment, the more the unfolding of our world will be shaped by us in ways that support, foster, and impel the future that we long for. And of course, there is so much more that could be said, but I'll stop there. I'd be happy to be in touch with anyone who's listened this far, and everyone is welcome to join me for regular online meditation gatherings that I host. If you'd like to be in touch, you can contact me at integratedemergence@gmail.com. Thank you all for joining me, and much love to you.